Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah. Hang on, there are still people coming in here. Yeah, maybe we should get started. That might speed them up, I don't know.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our session. I would like to welcome our speaker, Thomas Land from the University of Victoria. And the title of his talk is Objective Validity and the Copernican Thesis, Kant's Strategy in the Transcendental Deduction.
All right, thanks very much. Well, I guess on the handout I have the title as Copernican Turn instead of Copernican Thesis, but same idea, as you'll see. So, just for those who came in late, there's a handout here. There are still some copies left. The handout is also in the Dropbox where the talks and papers for this conference were collected, so you can access it either way. So I'm going to be talking about the transcendental deduction in the first critique, right? My interest is in how we should think about Kant's overall strategy, right? So I'm not going to be engaging with the sort of minute details of the argument there, but with the kind of overall strategy of the argument. What should the argument aim to establish, whether or not it does so successfully, right? So, I'm sorry, I get really distracted by this, so I'm going to close the door. So, it's clear that the aim of the transcendental deduction is to show that the categories are objectively valid, right? But the question is exactly how does Kant set about doing that? And there's disagreement about this, right? There's this disagreement even at the level of sort of overall strategy of the argument. And that's what I'm going to be concerned with. So there's a view that I want to present and then criticize and then suggest an alternative for that has been articulated in some recent literature, which I'm going to call the instantiation account. And so at this sort of overall general strategy level, that's the idea that what Kant must do in order to establish the objective validity of the categories is to show that they are instantiated, right? That the categories are instantiated, hence the name. And moreover, it's part of this view that if the categories are in fact instantiated, then that is a fact that obtains sort of independently of our possession of these concepts, right? It's just a fact about the world, as it were. So I'm going to be raising an objection for this view and then suggest an alternative view, which I call the unity view, which says that what Kant must aim to show is that the categories constitute the intellectual form, or the unity, as he likes to say, of experience. And I'm going to suggest that that's sufficient for establishing objective validity for the categories, because the objects of experience, the objects with regard to which the categories are to be shown to be objectively valid, are mind-dependent in a certain respect, right? And mind-dependent with regard to the properties, as it were, that the categories pick up. I'm going to say more about this later on. I'm just going to introduce the overall shape of the paper here now. And my argument in favor of this unity view and against the instantiation account is going to turn on the idea that the unity view can, but the instantiation account cannot, do justice to what I think is a central role in Kant's argument in the deduction of the inference from the claim that the categories make possible experience to the categories make possible the objects of experience. Okay, I'm going to call that the Copernican inference later on. So I'm going to proceed by introducing the instantiation account a bit more fully, raising my objection to it in slightly more detail, presenting my own view, and then briefly discussing an objection, or possibly two if we have time, to that view. Okay, so the instantiation account. We can helpfully characterize this view in terms of a couple of little theses that I want to introduce. So first of all, the thesis I'm going to call objective validity, which is just the claim that the categories are objectively valid. Right? And just to kind of just a sort of rough gloss on that. So I think that the categories are objectively valid just in case it's really possible for there to be objects that, that instantiate them, that they refer to. And if they are objectively valid, the categories that is, then it is legitimate for us to use them in cognition of object and so on and so forth. Right? I'm going to call instantiation the thesis that appearances instantiate the categories. And then I want to call category independence the view that if instantiation holds, if appearances instantiate the categories, then this fact obtains independently of the fact that we possess these concepts, or that anybody does. And so then we can, in terms of these theses, characterize the instantiation account as the view that Kant assumes category independence and then seeks to establish objective validity by arguing for instantiation. Right? So that's the instantiation account. What motivates this sort of account? So I should say that's a kind of, that account can be fleshed out in a variety of different ways, and different people have done so in slightly different ways. So I'm interested in the kind of that overall approach or picture. What motivates that sort of account? Well, in part, a shortcoming in rival accounts. Right? So we can bring this out as follows. Kant is often read as arguing, and he says in a bunch of places things to this effect, that we must use the categories in thinking. Right? There's sort of a claim to a necessity of some sort. Right? We must use the categories in thinking, but that claim, we must use the categories, is ambiguous between different readings. Right? And one way to read that kind of claim is to read it as expressing psychological necessity. We are so, psychologically speaking, we are so constituted that we cannot think in any other way than by using categories, right? So our minds are so constituted that we cannot fail to employ categories in thinking. That's what we must do in the sense of cannot help but do. That's the psychological reading. A different way of reading this claim, right, a different sense that can be given to that is to interpret it as talking about some kind of normative necessity, right? So I'm going to call this the normative reading. That reading says that we must use the categories in the sense that it's correct to so use the categories, or correct to use the categories, right? So the idea is that one must use categories in order to satisfy some relevant norm or standard. Now, proponents of the instantiation account argue that, correctly I think, only the normative reading is fit for Kant's purposes, right? This psychological reading would be bad for various reasons. I don't want to go into those now, but there's some connection with concerns about Hume there. Only the normative reading is fit for Kant's purpose, right? And some of these rival accounts to the instantiation account do not appreciate that. They either do not distinguish the two readings at all and just sort of run them together, or they're sort of happy with a kind of psychological interpretation of the claim, right? So here's how one proponent of this instantiation account, James Van Cleve, puts the point, right? It's the quote on the bottom of page 1 of the handout. Kant wants to show that the categories are objectively valid, that they actually apply to objects of experience. To reach this conclusion, he needs to show that any categories used in judging are actually exemplified by the items judged about, end of quote. Neil Gomes puts the same, who also shares this broad view, even though he disagrees with Van Cleve about all sorts of things, I think, puts the point in the following way, quote, the necessity of our application of categorical concepts, right, the fact that we must use them, must be grounded in the objects themselves rather than in aspects of our own subjective dispositions, in aspects of our own psychology, that is, right, end of quote. So like I said, there are various ways of fleshing out the instantiation account. I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail about that. I'm just going to mention one other proponent of this sort of account who disagrees with Van Cleve and Gomez's takes in various ways, but I think shares the central idea. I'm just going to give this brief quote here. That's Lucy Allays. So she says, next passage here on the handout, quote, Kant argues that the instantiation of the categories is a necessary condition of our having determinate objects of thought for empirical concept application. We do have successful empirical concept application, and so the objects of our cognition do fall under the categories. I think, for a 3-line summary of the Transcendental Deduction, that's pretty good, right? So, successful empirical concept application in the way Allays means this, as she makes clear, means that they refer. So that means that she's committed to the idea that the showing that the categories are instantiated plays an important part of the argument. I mean, in her version, right, Kant starts from the idea that we have successful empirical cognition, so that empirical concepts are instantiated, and then does the argumentative work of showing that that couldn't be there unless sort of categories were already, as it were, applicable to these objects and as it were at work in these empirical concepts, right? So he doesn't, as it were, explicitly argue that the categories are instantiated. He argues it in this more indirect way, but it's still playing a central role there. All right, so that's the instantiation account. Let me then raise an objection for it. So like I said, the objection is in kind of brief form that this account cannot do justice to the role that the inference from the claim that the categories are conditions of the possibility of experience to the categories are conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience plays in Kant's argument. Okay, so we can think of the instantiation account as taking the following view. The claim that we must use categories is to be understood in a normative sense. So there's some kind of standard or norm of correct use that the categories must be shown to meet. What is that norm or standard? Well, on this reading, that standard is given by the conjunction of the claim I was calling instantiation and the claim I was calling category independence, right? So the idea that the categories are instantiated and that fact holds independently of our possession of these concepts, if it is a fact. I want to argue now that this is incompatible with Kant's of Copernican orientation and, moreover, with the use that he actually makes of this inference in the deduction. Right, so let me go into a bit more detail on this then. So you all, of course, know the famous Copernican turn and these ideas that are announced in the B preface, right? So I have a few quotes here on the handout from this, right? Objects must conform to our cognition. That expresses the Copernican idea, right? But the cognitive capacity has two stems, and so if objects conform to cognition, then objects must conform to cognition in two respects, right? With respect to each of these faculties, to the constitution of our faculty of intuition and to concepts a priori. So these are quotes. That's what Kant actually says in the B preface, right? So this entails that appearances and appearances that constitute phenomena in Kant's technical sense conform to the categories, it seems, right? And that suggests that category independence fails. The relevant appearances seems to instantiate, so the appearances, whether all appearances or not all appearances, but the appearances that do constitute phenomena that do instantiate the categories, do so, according to this Copernican claim, it seems, in virtue of the fact that these concepts constitute our cognitive, the higher stem of our cognitive faculty, right? And that means in virtue of our possessing these concepts, not as a matter of independent fact, right? So I think the following passage, again from the B preface, makes that clear. Quote, if I assume that the objects, or what is the same thing, the experience in which alone they can be cognized as given objects conforms to those concepts, I immediately see that I have to presuppose in myself concepts a priori to which all objects of experience must therefore necessarily conform and with which they must agree. So I take it that necessarily conforming to these concepts and agreeing with these concepts entails that, that these objects instantiate the relevant concepts, right? So, and if that's right, then it seems that the negation of category independence is a claim that Kant kind of already announces in the B preface, and if that announcement, as it were, if that kind of sets the agenda, as it were, for the sort of argument that he gives in the deduction, then we should find that in the actual argument in the deduction, the negation of category independence plays an important role, right? Contrary to the way the instantiation account has it. And in fact, I think that is what we do find. Right? Kant draws what I call this Copernican inference, that from showing that something is a possibility of experience, in particular the categories, he infers to that thing is a condition of the possibility of the objects of experience. But think about that inference for a minute, right? That's just sort of in the abstract, taken by itself, why should that be a valid inference? Or why should that be a good inference to make? I think basically, actually, let me step back and say something else first. So I'm going to say something about the inference. First, I want to note that Kant clearly regards that inference as unproblematic. Okay, so he just kind of casually mentions it here and there, right? But by itself, the inference is not at all unproblematic, right? I think you can sort of read Barry Stroud's classic paper on transcendental arguments, right, from '68, in which he reacts to Strawson's sort of attempt to craft transcendental arguments as making exactly that point, that like Strawson only ever argues as far as certain concepts constitute the condition of the possibility of experience, but it doesn't follow from that therefore they constitute conditions of the possibility of objects of experience, right? So I think the inference sort of absent any kind of Copernican commitments, the inference seems crazy, right? So why should Kant draw it? So the second thing to note is that Kant deploys this inference at a key moment in the argument of the deduction. I have two passages on the handout here, one from the A, one from the B version of the deduction. I'm just going to maybe read the A version real quick and skip the B version. So he says here, bottom of page 2 of the handout, the a priori conditions of a possible experience in general are at the same time conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience. Now I assert that the categories are nothing other than the conditions of thinking in a possible experience, just as space and time contain blah, 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 blah. They, the categories, are therefore also fundamental concepts for thinking objects in general for the appearances, and they therefore, have a priori objective validity. Okay, so again, I think the B passage expresses the same idea, and in the B passage, I have highlighted the phrase in which I think the inference is being drawn, and there are several other passages where Kant kind of presents this move from condition of the possibility of experience to condition of the possibility of the object of experience in this sort of completely kind of en passant kind of way, right? He's just kind of, as if that's going to be just taken in stride, completely obvious. But again, I think the inference stressed, absent this kind of Copernican setup, is one that nobody should grant, right? Okay, so I think the very fact that Kant seems to regard the inference as unproblematic in this way, the fact that he draws it in this, casual fashion, shows, I think, that he regards it as unproblematic, not in need of further justification here. And I think that this suggests, that doesn't kind of knock down prove it, but I think this suggests strongly that he relies on this Copernican thesis at this point, right? So here's a way we could think about this. So experience is a type of representation ultimately, right? It's cognition of a certain sort. And so if the categories are conditions for the possibility of experience, then it seems being representable by means of categories is something that that has to be true of objects of experience. Right? We can represent objects of experience by means of the categories. Now, either being representable by means of categories is essential to being an object of experience, or it isn't. Right? If it's not, then it's hard to see why Kant should be entitled to draw this inference, or should take himself to be entitled to drawing this inference, right? But if it is, then it follows that if objects of experience are essentially such as to be representable through categories, if that's a part of their nature, then objects of experience are not, as it were, representation independent or mind independent in this respect, right? As it were, to be an object of experience is in part to be representable by means of categories. But if that is so, then the thesis of category independence that the instantiation account holds seems to be denied here, right? That would no longer hold. It would no longer be a fact that would hold independently of our possession of the categories, or of the fact that the categories constitute the form of the understanding, that the categories are instantiated, if they are, right? That fact would, if it is a fact, would no longer hold independently of the constitution of our cognitive faculty. But again, if category independence is not true, if Kant doesn't hold, or at least if Kant doesn't hold it, right, then it seems there is a valid avenue for inferring from claims about the nature of the representation to claims about the nature of the representation-dependent object, right? And in the way in which Kant, in the way in which Kant seems to be relying on when he draws this Copernican inference, right? So, since, however, that entails the denial of category independence, I think Kant's argument depends on that denial. So we can ascribe to him a commitment to category dependence, right? If appearances instantiate the categories, then appearances are essentially representable through the categories, or at least, this is a bit sloppy, the appearances that constitute objects of experience. Okay? Maybe that's a proper subset, maybe not, but right, you get the idea, I think. All right. Okay, so that's my objection to the instantiation account. Let me present my own view. Right? So on my view, Kant is committed to category dependence. There could be no object of experience if there was no power of representing object of experience by using categories. So it might maybe be useful to Jay, just a quick word of how this relates to transcendental idealism and to the transcendental aesthetic. And so let me just say something very briefly about that. So I think what Kant calls object of experience, what he sometimes calls phenomena when he's being somewhat strict, right, dependent on the mind in a twofold way, in accordance with the two-stemmedness of the cognitive faculty, right? They depend on sensibility for their spatial and temporal properties, and they depend on the understanding for their categorical properties. Maybe in the end you can't have one without the other, right? That's a possibility, right? I don't want to commit myself to any view on that score for now, but that's right. That's the idea. No chuckles allowed there. So, right? And I think there are passages where Kant basically says this, right? So again, I have a passage from B and from A here. The A one is shorter, so let me just read that. He says, quote, "As possible experiences, therefore, all appearances lie a priori in the understanding and receive their formal possibility from it, just as they lie in sensibility as mere intuitions and are only possible through the latter as far as their form is concerned." End of quote. Okay, so I think that illustrates this sort of twofold mind dependence, we might say. So I think I mentioned transcendental idealism. I didn't really say anything about that. So I think the transcendental deduction, the argument there presupposes transcendental idealism about space and time, right? It does so because it presupposes the idea that the categories are the concept of a discursive understanding, which is dependent for cognition on some kind of sensible material, right? And that, as the aesthetic has shown, is able to reach only as far as appearances, not as things in themselves. That leaves open the possibility that possibly, maybe, for all that's been said, things in themselves do instantiate categorical properties and do instantiate do have categorical properties, do instantiate the categories. Nothing is being said about that here. All right, so that's enough about that. Let's move on to Kant's strategy in the deduction on my view, on the unity view. Right? So I do think actually that that strategy is more closely parallel to the strategy Kant uses in the aesthetic with regard to the pure concepts of space and time than is perhaps often thought. Right? So it's helpful, I think, to think about the parallel. And so to think about the way he does it in the aesthetic. Right? So he there, according to his own account, secures the objective validity of the concepts space and time by arguing that these concepts pick out forms of sensibility, which in accordance with the Copernican thesis are at the same time forms of appearances. Right? So he says here, this is a quote from the lead up to the Transcendental deduction, quote, "For since an object can appear to us only by means of such pure forms of sensibility, space and time contain a priori the conditions of the possibility of objects as appearances, and the synthesis in these concepts has objective validity." So if Kant wanted to give an argument about the categories that was constructed in parallel with this move, right, he would have to say that, or he would have to argue that the categories are forms of understanding by means of which, and only by means of which, objects can be thought, and due to the Copernican thesis, these forms of thought are at the same time forms of objects, and so are therefore objectively valid. And so I think with one important, very important modification, that's the strategy that Kant pursues. The modification has to do with the limitation of objectively valid category use to objects of experience, right? As it were, just in and of themselves, the categories might be thought to apply to and be valid of objects that are not possible objects of experience, right? But it's part of the upshot of the deduction to show that that is not so. So the argument is limited to thought insofar as it figures in experience, and thought only insofar as it constitutes the intellectual form of experience. And so therefore only to objects that are representable in experience. Right? Important for the dialectic, of course. I think Kant then implements this general strategy in two distinct steps. Step one is to show that the categories constitute the intellectual form of experience. That step occupies almost the entire deduction, I think. Step in terms of like the text, where Kant works for that, as it were. And then step two would be to show that these forms fall within the scope of the Copernican thesis, as it were, to draw the Copernican inference. That goes by very quickly. Right? Kant doesn't sort of waste a lot of lines on carrying out that step. I think that this strategy depends on a characterization of experience that's not already framed in terms of the categories. And I think the role of the doctrine of apperception is to furnish such a characterization of experience, of the formal characteristic structure of experience to the extent that it derives from the understanding. But, right, so a different way of putting this is by saying that what Kant here tries to show is that he starts with a characterization of experience in terms of a certain kind of structure, or unity, as he likes to call it, right? And then argues that experience could not have that unity if we didn't use the categories in, as it were, generating experience, right? So therefore, then the categories are necessary for sort of constituting the intellectual form of experience. But I think this kind of hylomorphic terminology is significant here, right? Experience doesn't have just an intellectual form, but it also has a matter, right? That matter must be contributed by sensibility. And so that entails that there can be experience only if synthetic unity of apperception, right? The kind of, this is my shorthand here for the the unity that characterizes experience, can be realized or sort of implemented in suitable, sensible material. Right? So that's an important part of the argument. The argument wouldn't be complete by just showing that the categories constitute this form. It also has to be shown that this form is actually sort of is such that it can generate the right sort of form matter, or can go to partly constitute the right form matter compound experience. Okay, so to complete step one, Kant argues that synthetic unity of apperception can be realized in sensible matter only by means of employing categories. Right? That's the main idea. And so if that's right, then Kant's strategy for establishing objective validity is to argue for what I'm calling unity. Right? The categories make possible the synthetic unity that is the intellectual form of experience, where that includes this kind of implementation or realization in the right matter part. If that can be established, if unity can be established, Kant can then, and does, I think, use the Copernican inference to carry out step two and to complete the argument for objective validity. So do I have time for like a 2-minute?
You're at 30 minutes.
Oh, according to me, I'm only at 28. So
Sorry.
anyway, that's all right. We can just end it there, and probably this objection is going to come up anyway. So thank you.
Is it okay if we bundle the questions, or would you rather go by one?
I'd rather go one by one, if that's all right. Oh, it's because of the mic. I see. Oh, no. Maybe not.
Hello. Hi, my name is Zuka Arbaji. So I have like 3 questions, but I want to, I'll try to collapse
Bundle them.
into one. So I think I'm very sympathetic with your overall conclusion, but I have this worry that maybe you're turning this instantiation account into kind of a straw man.
Okay.
Well, first of all, Kant never uses language, often doesn't use the language of instantiation. He uses the language of application. So here's the thing. Yes, Kant, so there's a modality of instantiation that Kant tries to demonstrate in the deduction, right? It's not just simply that objects or appearances instantiate categorical properties, but they do so necessarily. And the only condition, the only way they can do so is if we necessarily apply categories to objects. So this is very much similar to the debate around the neglected alternative in the aesthetic, right? Objects of experience have only spatiotemporal properties if actually space and time are nothing but pure forms of intuition. So this kind of stuff. And who in their right mind can really hold the independence thesis here? Maybe there's something, I'm missing something here. The appearances instantiate the categories independently of our possession of the categories. That seems like a thesis that is like blatantly unviable. And so that's why I worry that maybe there's something more to this account than you characterize. Let me just quickly shoot the second question, and that's a more major question, the second question. So you seem to presuppose that, well, the unity view or the way Kant operates in the deduction presupposes the Copernican thesis. But the way I understand it is the reversed, right? The Copernican thesis is substantiated through the transcendental deduction and the aesthetic. So it seems like it's hard to justify a methodical claim based on the presupposition of the Copernican thesis. How would you justify the Copernican thesis itself then, right?
Good, yeah. So
thank you.
Let me comment on the first question briefly. So, I mean, so the language of instantiation is these commentators' language, not Kant's, right? So, I mean, look, Van Cleef talks about it, actually exemplified and this kind of stuff, right? So, I mean, I forget if he uses the word to instantiate, but it's pretty close, right? Well, but no, I think on this way of thinking about it, that would be kind of an imposition and could never possibly establish objective validity that would only, we cannot help but think of objects in these ways, but that's not what we wanted, right? That's subject to all these Humean skeptical worries. So no, it's got we need the kind of, right, if we want a kind of norm that our use of the categories needs to meet, and that norm had better be independent of our use of the categories, what could that possibly be if not the fact that that's actually what these objects are like, as it were, right? And so, I mean, there are different ways of fleshing this out, right? The kind of more sophisticated, or whatever, I shouldn't say that. A kind of sophisticated version is the one that Anil Gomes actually has, I think, which is where he argues that, well, once we get the full story about sensibility, then we'll come to see that, yes, the categories will be necessarily instantiated, and that's in part to do with how objects are, as it were, given to us. They're sort of the categories, so the instantiation of the categories so falls out of the way in which the categories are already involved in, I miscalculated. The way in which the understanding is already involved in actualizing sensibility, except not by bringing categories to bear, but in some other way, some merely apperceptive, synthesizing way or something that then sort of doesn't, already amount to having applied categories, but somehow makes it the case that it will be true that all the objects that can be given to us will instantiate the categories. Anyway, that was probably a botched way of characterizing his view. But so, last comment on that one. I think about the necessary agreement, necessary instantiation. I think you're exactly right, and that's sometimes a criticism that gets made. That I also actually have in the longer version of the paper. That's another problem with this sort of appeal to just instantiation. I think that's exactly right. But
would be miraculous, and then Kant hates that.
Right, so then there's that question, exactly. Then you run into that one, then you need a solution to that, right? How could it be more than just pre-established harmony or something, right? Yeah, so good, yeah. Let's not go into that. So what was the other question was?
The justification of the Copernican.
Oh yeah, Copernican. So, I mean, so I take this kind of talk of hypothesis and experiment in the preface seriously, I guess, or somewhat seriously. I do think the overall shape is that there's no sort of direct argument for the Copernican thesis. There's this argument that, well, if we proceed in this way, we will be able to explain things that otherwise cannot be explained, and which have a kind of prima facie, I guess, claim on our trying to make sense of them, right? That I don't know, synthetic a priori in mathematics and blah 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 blah, right? And so. So I do think that there's no sort of independent argument for the Copernican claim in the deduction, but it sort of substantiates it in the way in that it sort of shows that, so if we think about the categories as playing this sort of role, then we will be able to explain how there can be synthetic a priori judgments, and that will then, as it were, be the best explanation, or that will allow us to make an inference to the best explanation. This hypothesis is the one that we need to adopt. So, that you might not find that satisfying, but that's the idea.
So we have two questions.
Sorry, I took up way too much time in the answer. Sorry.
So I would suggest we bundle those two,
okay,
and then maybe we can get another one in.
I'm Michael Rolfe. A lot of ground was just covered after my question was generated. But
okay.
I was just going to ask about, you referred to the Humean subjective necessity worry that Kant himself refers to in the introductory sections common to both editions. It would seem to me that that's a reason for thinking that the argument structure between the aesthetic and the deduction is not parallel.
Right.
Because showing that these are forms of understanding wouldn't rule out the Humean alternative.
So I guess the way good. That's a great question, I think, actually. So I think, so bundling, sorry, of course, yeah.
Okay. So very quickly, I wonder if you could say more about the instantation account independently of our possession of the categories.
Right.
So what does that our mean?
Yeah.
Is it us as just persons, empirical subjects?
Uh-huh.
Or is it us as something else, transcendental subjects, and therefore already with normative authority over our judgments of objects.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah.
So this is the first one.
Oh, sorry.
and the second one is about the Copernican thesis. Objects of cognition conform to the constitution of cognitive faculties. So I wonder if that conformity could be adjectivated or qualified and to read normatively conform to the constitution of our cognitive faculties. I'm thinking that probably, maybe this is the last objection that you didn't present. I don't know.
That was the one that Michael raised.
Oh, okay. But anyway, just that. If you think there's something to be added for the sake of clarity to that Copernican thesis.
Okay, great. So I think, Michael, I think that's the objection that I didn't discuss here. But so just briefly, I think the sort of standard there, as it were, is being constitutive of the nature of finite cognition or something like that, right? And it's not somehow, it must be shown that the categories, as it were, or that our use of the categories conforms to that standard. And there are some uses of the categories that fail to do so, right? Not just any use of the categories meets that standard. One that is transcendent doesn't, right? And so there is, I think, where sort of the actual employment versus the meeting the norm come apart. And so I think that gives enough independence, as it were, between norm and sort of performance to not run into the human worry. But yeah, there's more to talk about there. Anyway, so first question, so second question first. I'm not sure I understood that. What would it mean for the objects to kind of, for the conformity to be normative on the part of the objects? And then but let me just get the other question out of the way then. I think sort of like discursive understanding, right? I think it's sort of, any discursive understanding, I think, well, will possess necessarily some categories or other, let me put it that way, at least, right? And so then whether we actually exist or something, I think, is a separate question. So it hinges on, I mean, I was speaking sort of casually about possessing. I mean, there must be somehow concepts possessed, as it were, by a power of understanding that is discursive, right? That's go to constitute that as a power of understanding. So that was the idea. So yeah, second question I would need to ask for clarification. But
Okay, so we have time for one more, I think.
oh, okay, all right.
Thanks, Thomas. Just a quick one on, so there's a lot that I would be sympathetic to if I knew what you meant by the object of experience. And so in the preface, he talks about the object having a twofold meaning. One is appearance, one is thing. And then explicitly introduces the example of the will in experience versus the will, same object, not as an experience. So which thing is being constituted by the categories in the way you want it to be? And if it's the thing in itself also, because it's the same object? So it's a dilemma. It's like either it's the same object, but then your thesis fails, or it's a different object, but then he shouldn't say what he says. I don't know if you have comments. Thanks.
Good, no, great. So I think it's appearances insofar as they constitute phenomena, right, as they also instantiate the categories, which maybe some appearances don't, or maybe they do, but, right? And I think the same object passages have to be read on the right kind of interpretation of transcendental idealism. And I guess I think there's a way of fleshing that out where it doesn't run into that horn of the dilemma, but that obviously takes, I just defer to people who have done that. I mean, I like Lanier Anderson's interpretation, so, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks so much. So, this is the mic. Here we are.
Okay.
Please, on the bottom. Yes. Think it's working? Yes.
I would like to introduce our next speaker, Lorenzo Spagnesi from the Universität Trier, who will speak on Kant on phenomenal substance.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. So let me start with some general remarks. There have been several studies recently on the notion of substance in Kant. Here you have a really non-exhaustive list of the studies. And, well, there are many interesting questions about substance in Kant, interesting historical questions about the development of Kant's thought from the critical to the critical period, and the relations between Kant and his predecessors. But I think there's also a crucial systematic issue that needs to be investigated a bit more. And this is the issue of phenomenal substantiality. In many places, Kant talks about phenomenal substances, substances in experience, what he calls also substantia phenomenon. But it's not really clear, at least to me, what the critical notion of substance really is. So one pressing issue is the following. Phenomena do not seem particularly compatible with the notion of substance that Kant seems to assume and analyze and criticize in many places in the Critique of Pure Reason. And that's the Leibnizian notion of substance as something simple, something possessing intrinsic properties. And I will say more about this in a minute. The problem here is that Kant's transcendental idealism seemed to result in a form of relationalism about phenomena. So the idea that phenomena are nothing but relations, they only possess relational properties. And so it's not clear how phenomena possessing only relational properties can be substances in the Leibnizian sense. So the research question, the question I want to ask and attempt to answer today is precisely whether and how phenomena consisting in mere relations can be substances, and substances in a proper sense, in a genuine and legitimate sense. So that's the question. The strategy is the following. So I concede that recent rehabilitations of substance in Kant are, in a way, on the right track. But I think we need to say more about how this notion is reconceptualized in a critical framework. And ultimately, I want to argue that that's the upshot of the paper, that Kant isolates a general notion of substance as ultimate subject and shows two things: that relational phenomena are compatible with this notion, and second, more specifically, that matter and all its parts are the ultimate subjects of everything existing in space, and more specifically as what is independently movable in space. Now, this may look and sound obscure now, but hopefully by the end of the paper it will be a bit clearer. Right, so a few words on the structure. I'm going to start by reviewing different conceptions of substance in the first critique. Then I'm going to analyze what I call here the internalist principle, which I think is the principle underlying the rejection of phenomenal substances in several important scholars, influential scholars. I think Kant does not commit himself to this principle, and so I will take a closer look at the Amphibole, where I think Kant provides an argument against this principle. So I will make sense of the argument, and then I will defend my interpretation from possible objections in the fourth section. And finally, quite importantly, I will take a closer look at the metaphysical foundations of natural science, where Kant explains what he means by material substance, and I think that provides support for my thesis in this paper. All right, so conceptions of substance. This is a very brief, simplified overview of a very complex issue. I think there are two notions of substance that are particularly evident in the first critique. The first one is phenomenal substance, so the topic of this paper, what I call here substance 1. And this corresponds to the schematized category, the first category of relation, whose schema notoriously corresponds to the persistence in time. And so I think that a fair characterization of phenomenal substance is something persisting in appearance. But categories can also be used independently of schemata. And so there's an aschematized category of substance as well, what I call here substance 2. And in many places, Kant seems to use this notion of substance to characterize noumena. And that's the Leibnizian conception I mentioned earlier. So you can find quotes supporting this. There is one, but there are many others. Here the idea, substance is something that has intrinsic properties and is free of composition, i.e. is simple. Right, so already at this point, we can tentatively ask the main question of the paper. So are phenomenal substances genuine substances? And at this point, I think we encounter, let's say, a dilemma, or maybe better, an unpleasant alternative. So the first one is that substance 1, phenomenal substance, is a mere surrogate, substitute, let's say, of what seems to be the only genuine notion of substance in the critique, namely nominal substance. And so you end up denying that phenomena are substances in a genuine sense. Or alternative, because at this point, again, it seems that the only genuine notion of substance is nominal substantiality. You can try to be more liberal and find ways to extend features of nominal substantiality to phenomena, right? And so this is the second solution, and in this way you can argue that phenomenal substances are genuine substances in a proper sense. I think that neither option is particularly promising, at least that's my impression. I think that the first option seems to jeopardize the whole Kantian project of a metaphysics of nature. So I think, and we will see also more details later when I will move to the metaphysical foundations of natural science, where Kant clearly talks about substances with respect to matter. And the second solution, the second option, seems to be an instance of transcendental realism, of extending nominal features to the phenomenal world, and so conflating appearances and things in themselves. All right, so I think there's thankfully a way out, a possible way out from this, and here I'm closely following Messina's solution in a recent paper, and the solution is to emphasize that there's a third notion of substance at play in Kant, which is also unschematized, but it's more general than substance 2. And that's what I call here substance 0, and that's the notion of substance as subject. So something that is a subject and not a predicate, and that's something we find in the table of categories, one of the ancestral concepts of our mind. Cool. So at this point, I think this is an elegant solution because it allows to say that phenomenal and nominal substances are indeed substances, are under substance 0, and we don't need to conflate phenomenal and nominal substantiality. I think that was the problem in the previous unpleasant alternative. Okay, so I think this is correct. I think this is grounded in the text. But I also think there are good reasons to put pressure on this solution. And more specifically, the problem is that it's not clear, at least to me, it's not clear how phenomenal substances as persistent things are indeed subjects. And to be more clear on this, I think this ambiguity is sort of reflected in the text, where Kant seems to oscillate between two versions of substance 0, what I call a modally weak and a modally strong version of the definition. So The modally weak version, substance 0 weak, would be something like this. Substance is something that can be a subject and not a predicate, whereas substance 0 strong reads as, so substance is something that must be a subject and never a predicate. And I think these two definitions have very different, or can have very different extensions, and so it makes sense to ask again the main question of the paper using the terminology I just introduced. So are phenomenal substances 0 weak or substances 0 strong? And here my assumption, and you can let me know, I mean, we can discuss about it in the Q&A, happy to receive feedback on this, is that only if we show that phenomenal substances are substances 0 strong, I think it makes sense to say that they are substances in a genuine proper sense. And the intuition I have is that substance 0 weak is just too weak to work or to act as a criterion of substantiality. Now, that there is a problem here, I think, is shown by the fact that, well, there's a scholarly debate about this, and there are scholars arguing in different directions. So I want to focus here on Langton's position on phenomenal substances. She's I think, one of the most explicit, or let's say, one of the most vocal opponents of the idea that phenomena can be substances in a strong sense. So she says that phenomenal substances are phenomena substantiata. So think about stuff like, I don't know, the rainbow or the battle. So let's say the rainbow is, in a sense, subject, a bearer of properties, but it must itself be predicated of something more fundamental, let's say, to keep the story simple, raindrops or some optic phenomenon. Okay, so that's the claim. The argument is, more specifically, the following. So phenomenal substances are not genuine substances because they do not pass what she calls the loneliness test. Right, so reading from her, a substance is a thing that can exist absolutely independently of its relations of other things. And then towards the end, if a substance can be lonely, it must have properties compatible with loneliness. So a substance must have intrinsic properties. Again, I mean, here there are interesting questions about how to formalize this, and there are some tricky details about this test, but happy to say more in the Q&A. Now, let's stick with the main line of argument. The idea here is that phenomena don't seem to be compatible with loneliness, and so, and the reason behind this is that Kant, for Kant, phenomena consist only of relations, as I said before, therefore possess only relational properties. Here there's a quote, but you can find many other similar quotes in the text. Okay, so if this is correct, then phenomenal substances wouldn't be genuine substances, substances 0 strong, and more importantly, the properties of substances would need to be predicated of the intrinsic properties of things. And I think this is actually what motivates, what grounds the loneliness test itself. That's I mean, my suggestion is that it's the reason behind, or the ground of the loneliness test. And I think this is a key assumption that I call here the internalist principle. And it's interesting because we find this assumption in Langton, but we also find it in Lucia Les and also Daniel Warren and other scholars. So the idea is that relational properties, this is the principle, as I spell it out, relational properties must be grounded in the intrinsic properties of things. All right, so I think Kant does not commit himself to the principle. I think Kant thinks that the principle is false of phenomena, and actually that he provides an argument about this in the Amphiboly. The argument itself is quite complicated, so here it's a quite simplified reconstruction of it. Again, happy to say more later. So the first leg of the argument is like that. So you have a definition. The inner is the concept of the substratum of all relations, right? And then you have two conclusions from that. One is that if we abstract from our relations, then we are left with something, the concept of something which is absolutely internal, which is supposed to be an analytic truth. And then C2, in everything or substance, there is something absolutely internal grounding its relations. And that's, I think, what I called here internalist principle, and that people like Langton or Allais seem to accept. But I think Kant doesn't accept this principle. And in fact, Kant says that C2 only seems to follow. And he also provides an argument, like a diagnosis of what's going on wrong here. So here is the second leg of the argument. So the first two premises are from the aesthetic, and I will say more about them in a bit. P2, things of outer intuitions are given to us only in space. And then P3, that's the problematic bit. Space and what it contains consist only of purely formal or real relations. And if that's correct, then in things of outer intuition, there is nothing absolutely internal grounding their relations. And I found this, at least prima facie, incompatible with internalist principle. So what I'm doing now, I say more about the premises, and then I will defend my interpretation against possible objections. Okay. So P2 and P3, I think they follow from Kant's doctrine of space. P2 should be quite straightforward. I mean, it's controversial, of course, but things of outer intuition are given only in space. But if one accepts the aesthetic, I think this follows quite unproblematically. But P3, I think, is trickier, right? Kant, on the one hand, rejects the idea of the Newtonian idea of space as an absolute object, but he also rejects the Leibnizian conception of space as the order of relations among things, right? So another relational conception of space. So here, space is relational in a specific way, which I think results from the non-conceptual nature of space as intuition. And here I'm thinking of the aesthetic, where those passages where Kant says that space can only be represented as single. And so it's not that we put together spaces and we form the intuition of space, but rather different spaces are nothing but limitations, right, of a single representation. And in technical terms, this is an ideal compositum. So a composite where the whole precedes the parts and make them possible. Right. So one way to represent this, and this is a Kantian example, the cubic foot in space. We cannot represent a cubic foot if not surrounded or bounded by the space, which surrounds it. And here the idea is that also the parts composing the cube are not ultimate parts, but are themselves wholes that can be further divided into parts indefinitely. Okay, so I think it's precisely this mereological structure of space that explains why, for Kant, space contains principles of the relations of appearances prior to all experience, and why, ultimately, for Kant, corporeal things are still always only relations. Now, of course, here there are some gaps. I'm happy to say more in the Q&A. I haven't said much about the difference between real and formal relations, for example, that seem to play an important role in Kant's argument. All right. So if this is correct, I think Kant subscribes to two related claims. So one is that things of outer intuition have only relational properties, and two, such relational properties have nothing intrinsic as their ground. Now, here the problem, I think, is that a supporter of the internalist principle may, I think, accept the first part of the claim but reject the second one. So they might defend something like the following, namely that relational properties are grounded in intrinsic properties of things in themselves. And we find this in the literature. One way to argue for this, the first objection can be found in Allais, her book. And here the idea is that logic, we cannot just derive metaphysical truths from logic, but still logic informs metaphysics. So the idea is that if we know that something is logically impossible, then we also know that it's really impossible. And so here the idea is that there are relations without intrinsic properties is logically impossible, so it would also be really impossible. I think it's a plausible way to go, but I don't really accept I don't accept the application of this premise to the present case, because I think what Kant is arguing specifically in the amphiboly, in the remarks of the amphiboly, where the arguments I just analyzed come from, is that something that is true of concepts may be false of particulars standing under them. And the idea here is that particulars contain more than their concepts, and that's precisely why they are particulars, right? And so in this case, the internalist principle fails to obtain when we consider the specific way in which phenomena are given to us in intuition. And importantly, I think there's no violation of logical consistency here, because even if false of phenomena, the principle remains logically true. We just need to abstract from intuition. All right, so that's the first reply. But of course, one can put pressure on this. And one way to put pressure on this is to say that pure concepts of the understanding still allow insight into things in themselves, independently of how things are intuited. And I think there are different ways to reply to this. The one I have here is more textual, so I think there are other ways. Maybe I can say more later. So here the idea is that Kant is skeptical as to whether conceptual truths inform us about what's true of things in themselves. So for example, here in this passage, Kant says that if we abstract from intuition, from sensible condition, then we are only left with a logical significance. And Kant says no object, and thus no significance is given to them that could yield a concept of the object. But this is a problem for the internalist, I think, because the internalist requires that we know that things in themselves have intrinsic properties. So weaker epistemic attitudes like belief, for example, which may be acceptable here, still don't work for the internalist, for the hardcore internalist, I think. And it's interesting that Kant uses the category of substance as an example and says that the category shows me nothing at all about what determinations, and I read these as, for example, whether intrinsic or relational. The thing that is to count as such a first subject is to have. Again, there are other ways to reply to this, and I'm happy to say more later. Okay, so last section of the paper. So far, I've argued for a negative thesis, so the idea is that phenomenal substances must not be predicated of something non-relational. But I haven't said much about the positive side of the story. So in what sense can Kant maintain that phenomena are substances zero strong? So can only be thought as subjects and never as predicate. That's what we wanted in the setup of the problem. Now, there is a textual case here, because Kant in the Metaphysical Foundations clearly talks about matter and all its parts as substances, despite them being, despite the fact that they are divisible and relational. But what is the argument? Is there an satisfactory argument here? I think there is in the dynamics chapter. So, and here it's interesting because you have the first premise is precisely substance zero strong, what we want, right? Or at least what seems to be adequate in this case. So the concept of a substance means the ultimate subject of existence. Then premise 2 is the thing that we need to clarify. Kant says, now matter is the subject of everything that may be counted in space as belonging to the existence of things. For aside from matter, no other subject would be thinkable except space itself, which, however, is a concept that contains nothing existent at all. And then the conclusion, thus matter as the movable in space is the substance therein. Dense passage, of course, but let's try to make sense of it. So let's try to make sense of the second premise, right? Why is matter the only thinkable existing thing acting as ultimate subject of everything in space, everything existing in space? I think, at least for me, not an easy question to answer, but I think the following two remarks may shed some light on it. So the first one is, this is what Kant calls the metaphysical conception of matter in the metaphysical foundations. So the idea is that matter is the object of sensation in outer intuition, and so something like this would follow from that. So every object of outer sense is matter, right? So I think already here we have, in some sense, a minimal notion of subject at play. So the idea that matter is a sort of ultimate component of everything in outer intuition, and this may already grant some sense of substantiality in phenomena. But it's not really clear why matter is the only subject, and this is a gap that also Strawson noted. And I think that we can make sense of this if we focus a bit more on the characterization of matter as the movable in space, which in fact appears in the conclusion of the argument. Now, for Kant, there are several passages in the Metaphysical Foundations where Kant says that the movable in space is the basic fundamental characterization of matter. He also says that it's the ultimate subject of all material accidents. The reason for this is quite obscure. The idea ultimately is that outer sense cannot be affected without motion. And this is a cryptic claim, and scholars have tried to find convincing arguments explaining this. This is the so-called affection argument. So one justification is offered by Friedman, and here the idea is that affection implies movability because it always requires a relation to a reference frame, and more specifically to the subject. So it's a sort of embodied subject kind of explanation. And Maclear has a different justification where basically affection implies movability because it requires alteration in spatial properties. Now, I want to remain neutral on this. I'm not sure which justification works. Maybe there's a third, better justification. The important thing is that there is a serious way of defending what seems to be Kant's ultimate take on this. So the idea that outer sense cannot be affected without motion. All right, so if this is correct, I think we can say that matter is substance zero strong in the following sense, and there's another quote from the Metaphysical Foundations. Material substance is that in space which is movable in itself, that is, in isolation from everything else existing external to it in space. So I think that ultimately independent movability is what defines substance at both the global and local level of matter, because for Kant also all parts of matter are substances as well. Maybe there's something more to say about this, but let's say I'll leave it for later. Okay, so some clarifications. I'm not saying that the independent movability is the empirical criterion of substantiality. I think this criterion is activity. Kant says that quite clearly in the second analogy. And also importantly, I'm not saying that this is independent movability is the complete definition of matter as substance. I'm only saying that it's a basic characterization of matter as substance, but it's completely compatible with this. So for example, saying that matter is movable insofar, for example, as it has repulsive and attractive forces. So you can add more stuff to the concept of material substance. I think this is quite obvious, I mean, or not necessary. Just the last two slides. I just want to go very briefly back to the critique, where I think these ideas are already present. And I'm want to read this interesting passage, which is a bit dense, but I think we can extract two interesting claims. So Kant says, whatever we can cognize only matter is pure relations. That which we call their inner determinations is only comparatively internal. But there are among these some self-sufficient and persistent ones, through which a determinate object is given to us. The fact that if I abstract from these relations, I have nothing further to think at all, does not cancel out the concept of a thing as appearance, nor the concept of an object in abstracto, but does cancel all possibility of such an object determinable in accordance with mere concepts, i.e. the concept of a noumenon. So again, dense passage, there are details that I don't fully understand, but I think two interesting claims can be extracted from this. One is that phenomena consist in nothing but relations does not cancel out there being things in appearance. So for example, and actually importantly, we can identify what Kant calls comparatively inner or internal properties. So I think it would be interesting to know more about these properties. What are they exactly? What it does cancel out is the possibility to determine them phenomena in accordance with mere concept. For example, through the internalist principle. And here there's, I think, a lingering question, and that's the question of, if phenomenal substances possess only relational properties, then it would be interesting to ask whether and how they can be efficacious, whether and how they can be explanatory of natural processes, but I will leave that to another occasion. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have 9 minutes for questions. Andrew.
Thanks very much, Lorenzo. I was just wondering if this pushes you in a certain direction on the nature of transcendental idealism, because it looks like it bars you from saying that, well, from accepting any of the metaphysical one-world solutions, according to which these, material properties are just mind-dependent properties and ultimately are not the subject of ultimate predication. The things in themselves are. So is that an implication that you're willing to accept? Maybe you're just going to say, yeah, I'm a two-world person and I don't care about losing all of that.
Thanks for the question. No, I think ideally in this paper I would like that what I claim here is neutral about that. So if you
but on those kinds of views, matter is going to itself be ultimately a mind-dependent property of a thing in itself. So it can't be the ultimate subject of predication.
So I would say, yeah, I think that here it's the claim is about phenomena, and in a way, at least as I see it, I'm not committed to any specific relation between phenomena, the whole of phenomena, and the things in themselves grounding them. So
okay, so substance zero, it could be substance zero even if it's still itself a predicate of a thing in itself.
Yeah. The thing in that case would be, so I actually have a slide also, but maybe it's not necessary actually. So yes, I entertain this possibility that because the two objections that I have are epistemic in nature, so I don't rule out the what I would say it's a logical possibility, but let's say the possibility that things in themselves, in fact, are substances in the Leibnizian sense, actually. But I would say that even if that were the case, then I think it would be wrong to think that there is transitivity between the two realms. So the idea is that, so you have two different grounding relations, I think, here. One is the one holding at the level of phenomena, and the other one is holding between the whole of phenomena and things in themselves. And I think that we need to be careful and not conflate the two. The idea is that they respond to different domains. So even if the things themselves were substances, still that wouldn't imply that matter is not it. That would be my fallible answer.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. Very interesting. I'm just wondering whether you might not be able to draw the justification for Kant's claim that matter is the only phenomenal substance simply from his claim that we can only prove persistence of things that are in space. And like if you think of subjecthood here as the subject that persists through change, then like something that cannot persist cannot be a subject in this sense. So do we not already get a justification for why matter is the only phenomenal
question
substance?
would be that the justification is just the category, like the phenomenal substance
Right.
as such, like persistence is
Right,
enough.
applicability of
Yeah.
substance to
Yeah.
things in space. And I mean, matter is the highest genus concept of objects of outer sense,
Yeah.
anyway. So anything that is in space would fall under the concept of matter. I mean, just a suggestion.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting and also quite difficult question. I think there are so the whole project, in a way, of the paper is to sort of bridge the gap, if that makes sense, between phenomenal substance in the sense of the category and, let's say, a genuine notion of substance. I mean, what I take to be a genuine notion of subject, through a third element, which then relies on space. And I think there are passages suggesting this. So in the critique, for example, Kant says that we cannot rely on time because time flows. I mean, I haven't put this because it would further complicate what is already a very complicated paper. But yeah, so I think that anything I'm saying here, I mean, ideally anything I'm saying here is still compatible with the picture that, I mean, yeah, I mean, matter is substance and also is, also because it's what's persistent in time. So ideally this is a missing piece, but it's not incompatible with your suggestion. But yeah, I need to think more about it. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. That was really interesting. This is very naive, but so subject in the definition of substance zero, it's not supposed to be the subject of change, right? Because that's a different definition.
Mm.
But then on a very naive reading, substance zero sounds very kind of linguistic or grammatical. And back in the 60s,
Yeah.
people did embrace this. And they're like, yes, that's great. It does yield all these weird results, like any proper noun, like a fictional character, seems to become a substance that's really bad. So I don't think it's Kant's view, but I'm just wondering, like, I was missing maybe the move from substance zero to how do we get all back to the metaphysics again with intrinsicness and relational properties in your account? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, maybe this can be an assumption I'm making in this paper, but I would say that the notion of subject here at play is not merely grammatical, or it's also grammatical, but it has like a real dimension as well. So I think it's compatible with the view that with the idea that the idea of subject ultimately identifies a genuine notion of substantiality, not just a logical or conceptual. So maybe it's an assumption I'm making here, but yeah.
This is kind of a related question. I don't think that definition of substance is that bad. You can think of, for example, my friend's dog, Philip. Philip bears properties, but Philip himself is not a property.
Okay, turn on the light. Green? On green?
Okay. Yeah. So think of like an Aristotelian notion. So Philip the dog is the bearer of certain properties, but is not himself a property. So that's like substance zero. That also seems like a phenomenal substance, and that seems like a totally good view. Why doesn't Kant like that view?
Right. I mean, I think the problem here is just that. So it goes back to the affection argument and the idea that you need. Matter. You can say that. So you need to say that matter is the subject of everything existing in space, and you need something like that also at the local level when you talk about particular substances. But I think the argument works only, or at least for Kant, only if you're talking about parts of matter as such. So I think there's a gap here between the material dimension, like the purely material level of explanation, and let's say dogs or I don't know, chairs or stones, whatever. Then there's a further argument that I'm not sure how to fill in right now, honestly. But I think that the matter works because you have the sort of I don't like to say reducibility, but let's say all predicates of things in space can be in a way either supervene or can be reduced to motion with respect to matter. So that's why. So in that case, Kant has this strong argument. I'm not sure about the rest. Maybe a certain reading of the first analogy is enough, and you can fill in the gap.
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, it's not only Kant. So many modern philosophers were anti-Aristotelian about this, but it just seems like Aristotle has, I think, a perfectly good discussion of things that could instantiate what you would call substance zero strong, and
right.
Yeah, they missed it, I think.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Let's thank our speaker.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I also uploaded the handout onto the Dropbox.
Do you use the laptop?
No.
Oh, okay. So this is the mic. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's welcome Mathis Koschel from the University of Southern California. He's going to speak about the idea of mechanistic nature.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Also, thanks for the setup, because a lot of what Lorenzo was talking about will help me. I'll just chip in a bit more of ideas of reason. So my paper is called, the talk is called The Idea of Mechanistic Nature, and I'll set up a problem and then try to solve it. The problem is that Kant seems not to have a unified sense of mechanism. And to state the central claim, it's on the handout. I think there is a primary sense of mechanism which refers to mechanistic explanations. And then secondarily, or there's a second sense which flows from the first one, and their mechanism is to be understood in light of a conception of nature as a mechanical system. So this claim, I think, has wide-ranging implications for how I think we should understand Kant's account of organisms and human freedom. So I'll first set up the problem and then present my solution. Mechanism seems to be used in many ways in Kant's works. Central issue here is that there is one central usage in the metaphysical foundations, and that seems to be quite different than, for example, its usage in the critiques. Where in the critiques, Kant talks about mechanical inexplicability of organisms, or about the opposition between mechanism and freedom. So the first central usage here is the one from the metaphysical foundations. First quote on the handout, quote, "In mechanics, the force of a matter set in motion is considered as communicating this motion to another," end of quote. So here, mechanics, or mechanism, which I think is to be understood in light of mechanics, but or to connect it to the main topic, but here just about mechanics, means to consider matter as communicating motion to other matter. And that happens by means of forces. Now, there's a different usage, paradigmatic one. There are different ones. I relate to that in a footnote. B preface, you probably all know it. Quote, "Now, if we were to assume that the distinction between things as objects of experience and the very same things as things in themselves which our critique has made necessary, the distinction, were not made at all, then the principle of causality, and hence the mechanism of nature in determining causality, would be valid of all things in general as efficient causes. I would not be able to say of one and the same thing, for example, the human soul, that its will is free, and yet that it is simultaneously subject to natural necessity, i.e. that it is not free, without falling into an obvious contradiction, end of quote. So here we have a usage of mechanism, where mechanism seems not to relate just to matter communicating motion to other matter, as in the first quote. Rather, it seems to apply to appearances in general, and it means, I think, to everything in nature. Similar quotes in the footnote. So we seem to have here a narrow sense of mechanism, as I said, pertaining to matter and motion, billiard balls, planetary movement. And we have a very broad sense of mechanism as pertaining to everything in nature. Now, the latter sense seems also to be in play when Kant talks about explanation. Two quotes here. Kant says that we explain natural phenomena by means of the mechanism of nature. Third critique, end of the dialectic of the second half, dialectic of the teleological power of judgment. And second point, or second instance, where Kant talks about explanation, here from the first critique in the appendix. We explain natural phenomena by seeking their causes in the universal laws of the mechanism of matter. Now, it's of course a question here, what does natural phenomena mean here? Presumably it will involve motion, very, very likely, but then there are other phenomena, heat, light, magnetism. Now, of course, the question, organisms, human actions. Do they also fall under the natural phenomena here, so that we explain them by means of the mechanism of nature? The problem here is about the unity of the concept of mechanism is that light, magnetism, organisms, and human actions are prima facie very different phenomena. So, well, for one among each other, but then also then matter communicating motion to other matter. So we have a problem, how do these senses of mechanism hang together? In the secondary literature, I have this, where I counted this when working on the third critique. What is done is that several senses of mechanism just get differentiated. Henry Allison does this, and then Hannah Ginsberg goes even further and differentiates 7 senses of mechanism. And that is interesting. It's great to know how the different senses are used. But the problem is now we don't have any unity. Is there, does Kant just arbitrarily use sometimes the one sense of mechanism, sometimes the other sense of mechanism? Should he have gone to a proper American grad school to have more control over his concepts? So, I think that would not be a charitable reading. Also, there is a further, let's say, systematic pressure on the concept of mechanism, namely, Kant uses the term in order to formulate the antinomy about organisms. Antinomies come with a certain necessity, though. So the concept of mechanism, at least as used in the antinomy, must come with a certain necessity. So it cannot be completely arbitrary, at least on Kant's own, by Kant's own lights, how we should understand the concept of mechanism. But how can we make sense of that? So because of this necessity, I would say there must at least be some a priori grounding for the concept of mechanism, at least as used in the antinomy about organisms. But it's unclear how this necessity can be shown. It seems that at best the necessity can be shown for the very narrow sense of mechanism, the one that only pertains to the clearly mechanical phenomena, billiard balls, celestial mechanics, planetary movement. There's also a further problem that, now we again have the problem, also in the third critique also, mechanism is definitely used in relation to organisms, so it pertains to organisms. And that goes so far that there is even a certain dilemma that Peter McLaughlin has formulated, because time is of the essence. I had to cut it, but it's in the there are 2 addenda, and addendum 2 is McLaughlin's dilemma, why we seem to be at a loss how to understand the concept of mechanism as used in the antinomy about organisms, or organized beings, as Kant calls them. Okay, also with respect to the threat to human freedom, one may think, well, there must be some punch behind the concept of mechanism, otherwise if it's just an arbitrarily adopted concept, then, well, let's avoid the threat to freedom by avoiding the concept of mechanism. That should not really work. Also, I mean, the necessity, I think, should also explain, the necessity of the concept of mechanism that I want to argue for should also explain the attraction to the concept of mechanism as it was present in early modern times, which is, I think, also, I don't know, related to the attraction that physical reductionism had in 20th century analytic, at least, philosophy. Okay, so that's the problem. How can we understand the concept of mechanism in Kant? My suggestion, to spell it out a bit more before properly arguing for it, is that the necessity of the concept of mechanism stems from the construction of the concept of matter as it is carried out in the metaphysical foundations. Now, mechanism as constructed in the metaphysical foundations is necessary because if anything is given to us through the senses, then our perception has matter, then there is matter, and thus, at least if the metaphysical foundations work, then the content of the metaphysical foundations follows. So there's a certain, as Kant says, it's the metaphysical foundations are not transcendental but metaphysical. They are a priori given the empirical concept of matter. So if that's right, then there's at least some necessity, check, to the concept of mechanism in this narrow sense. But what about the unity? How can we get a unified concept out of this necessity? So as I said before, the laws of mechanics laid out in the metaphysical foundations hold for the clearly mechanical phenomena, planetary motion and so on. I now think what happens here is that we can use these laws of mechanics as laid out in the metaphysical foundations to create, as it were, a concept of nature as thoroughly mechanistic. And now, further part, I want to say this concept is a mere idea, and that this is often missed and very important. From this it then would follow, last bit of what I want to suggest before I go to the argumentation. From this it would follow that mechanism, when used in relation to organisms and human beings, is to be understood in light of the idea of mechanistic nature, as I want to call this concept of nature we can create on the basis of the laws of mechanics. Before I go into the argument, one note. Kant has one usage of mechanism that I think is not really his own. It's in the metaphysical foundations, in the general remark to the dynamics, and there Kant talks of the mechanism of yore, as it were. He talks about Descartes and atomists, and there he just refers, I think, to mechanism as it was used by his predecessors, where mechanism just means like things bump into each other and thereby communicate motion. Contact action, this is sometimes called. I think Kant himself refines that concept of mechanism. Daniel Warren has a very nice paper on that called Kant's Mechanics, where Kant's Dynamics, where he shows that in what way Kant in the metaphysical foundations shows how the old school mechanism is relying on a dogmatic presupposition, namely exactly in the contact action. Kant solves this by means of forces, but or that's Kant thinks is better to go with forces. So just to say, there is this usage, and also to flag it already now, there is a progressive character to the metaphysical foundations. So when Kant talks of dynamical relations, I think they get, as it were, taken up in the later chapter, the mechanics chapter, so that he can use the term mechanism and mechanical laws to relate to all the laws that Kant has laid out in the metaphysical foundations. Okay, now to my argument. So what I first want to do in order to argue for what I just said is to distinguish between two concepts of nature. So first question, what is for Kant nature? Many quotes, here's one. This is first critique. Quote, by nature, in the empirical sense, we understand the combination of appearances as regards their existence, in accordance with necessary rules, that is, in accordance with laws. There are therefore certain laws, and indeed a priori, which first make a nature possible. The empirical laws can only obtain and be found by means of experience, and indeed in accord with its original laws, in accordance with which experience itself first becomes possible. End of quote. So there are these a priori laws. I think it's the principles of the understanding. What I want to mark here is that there is this concept of nature that we get by means of these a priori laws. And that concept I want to call the formal concept of nature. This is also characterized in other passages as the sum total of appearances. And that concept I want to distinguish from a second concept of nature, which I call slightly different than how Kant and other points uses that concept. I want to call the material concept of nature, which also is the unification of all appearances, but now not just in this abstract and formal way, well, whatever accords with the principles of the understanding, whatever we'll find, but rather the second concept of nature, the material concept of nature, as I want to call it, involves an a priori conception of how all appearances can be unified. So there's some material determination. So the principles of first critique, we have merely formal principles, and once we try to answer the question, well, how concretely, how materially can all appearances be unified, we move to the second concept of nature. Question, of course, how exactly? And I think, well, by means of the principles of mechanical physics, which are laid out in the metaphysical foundations. Now, question, how does this exactly look like? Unifying all appearances by means of a concept of nature which flows from the principles of mechanical physics. And I think the answer is, well, what one could call reduction to mechanical explanation. So this is a quote from a pre-critical writing, but I think it works for my purposes, from the only possible argument. Quote, "It is with good reason presumed that the expansion of bodies through heat, light, electric force, thunder, perhaps even magnetic force, are many kinds of appearance, of one and the same effective matter which is spread out in all spaces." End of quote. So the claim is here we have these many phenomena, I referred to them before, and Kant says they are appearances of matter. And I think, okay, what does appearance here mean? I would say, well, we can understand this as saying reduced, like we give a mechanical explanation of heat, light, electric force, thunder, perhaps even magnetic force. That's my suggestion. Right, so I want to say one thing. Maybe some of you, the alarm bells already went off. Doesn't Kant use formal and material nature in a different sense? Yes, he does. In Metaphysical Foundations, yeah, it's on the handout. In the Metaphysical Foundations, in the preface, and in the Prolegomena, Kant distinguishes a formal and a material sense of nature. This is not the distinction between formal concept of nature and material concept of nature as I make it. The distinction that I make is basically between what Kant in these passages calls material concept of nature, or natura materialiter spectator, I think, or something. Yeah, so just caveat. Good. Now I want to move to the second step of my argument here, which can be motivated by, well, okay, Kant says here in the quote from the only possible argument that it is with good reason presumed that we can, I think, reduce all these phenomena to matter, and I think that means mechanical relations, because mechanics means matter communicates motion. But why is that? Why is that with good reason presumed? And I think this can be argued in the following, can be answered, or this question can be answered in the following way. There's a normative orientation of theoretical cognition towards mechanical physics. Kant says so in the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations. So there, second and third page of the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations, there Kant makes a distinction between proper and improper sciences. Mechanical physics is the one proper science, eigentliche Wissenschaft, and then he contrasts this with chemistry as an example of an improper, uneigentliche science, Wissenschaft. But I think biology, geology, psychology, anthropology also fall under that. Now, the improper natural sciences ought to be like mechanical physics, Kant claims there, in some sense of ought. So, and why is that? Kant says because mechanical physics has a priori principles. Which one are these principles? Kant does not directly say, but I think they are the laws of mechanism as laid out in the Metaphysical Foundations. I think that would make sense because it's the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations. So this argument here is that I just sketched, I think can be spelled out in the following way. Our capacity for cognition, our Erkenntnisvermögen, aims at the unity of cognitions. And the principles of improper sciences are empirical, and that Kant says, by the way. And I think that means they are only contingently true. Empirical, contingently true. But contingency is exactly the absence of unity. So as long as the improper sciences have only empirical principles, are they not unified with the other improper sciences and the rest of cognition, I think. And so it follows, only with a priori principles is it so much as possible to unify all cognitions and thus appearances. So this is how I think there's this a priori demand created for improper sciences to be, as I would say, reduced to mechanical physics. And this is why mechanical reduction is, with good reason, presumed. So at this point, we have a material concept of nature, which is unified by means of the a priori laws of mechanical physics. And all other sciences, if not cognition, in some sense ought to be like mechanical physics so that we can unify it all and have thorough unification of all appearances. Now, last step, in order to, I think, make sense of the concept of mechanism. The material concept of nature, as just laid out, is an idea of reason. So we justifiably strive towards unification of all appearances by means of mechanism. Yet we cannot achieve a state in which we actually have reduced all laws to mechanistic laws, I think. Why is that? So I think the answer to that is in the introduction to the third critique. Here is Michael Friedman, who glosses a passage that is impossible to quote, but he summarizes it nicely, I think. It's a whole page. So here's Friedman's quote, glossing what Kant does in page 183 of Academy Edition, Volume 5. Quote, since the manifoldness of empirical laws is potentially infinite, we can imagine a grounding for the totality of empirical laws only as the regulative ideal of a complete science. We can continually approach but never fully attain. End of quote. Now, I would paraphrase this in the following way. We can never justifiably say to have unified all empirical laws, because, qua empirical cognizers, we can never justifiably say to have experienced everything there is. So this would be one reason for why reduction to mechanical laws is only an aim, nothing we could ever achieve, attain. I mean, we can do to some degree, but there's always more to be done. Now, a further reason one could say, also drawing on a central topic of the introduction to the third critique, is even if we assume that the manifoldness of empirical laws is finite, it's not up to us whether we will really succeed in unifying a given set of empirical laws. So nature must be cooperative, as it were. Newton's great achievement to unify celestial mechanics and terrestrial mechanics was to some degree up for nature being so cooperative as to allow for that. Equally, right now we've tried to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity. But is nature really off to such that this will succeed? Is nature so kind to us that all our scientific endeavors will ultimately succeed if we only do it rightly? So I think we can say there's no a priori reason for why the world, as I just said, why the world should be so cooperative. There's a third reason that could be stated, which is not exactly about unification of empirical laws, but also has a bearing. It's from the third antinomy. Namely, we could say, well, if we actually attain, like if the concept of mechanistic nature would be a concept with actuality, that would mean everything is de facto explained mechanically, but that, one could say, undermines the its own presuppositions, because the concept of explanation involves, I mean, arguably, not my main claim here, but I think it's true, the concept of explanation says what we want to explain here is to be explained, well, in the way sketched. So if we say something is to be explained mechanically, then we say, oh, the following phenomenon is to be explained mechanically. And here we have a claim to, this is to be explained in the way, as I say, but that claim would fall away if really absolutely everything could be explained mechanically. So, I mean, side issue, it's an interesting claim, but not my main thing. How am I on time?
You're at 23:40.
Ooh, great, thank you. Okay, so here are many quotes that, now a barrage of quotes that I think support my reading. The first one is quite astonishing from the general remarks. I won't go into that. Well, I mean, you see, I gave it titles so that it's easy to see what the quotes say or what I think the quotes say. So here, it's astonishingly strong, maybe even too strong. Kant says that the metaphysical foundation, I think it means the metaphysical foundation that he does in the metaphysical foundations, in the MFNS. This metaphysical investigation is useful only for the purpose of guiding natural philosophy. So here we have the guiding thing, so as to support my claim that the material concept of nature as a mechanical system is a mere idea. So we here have the bit with dynamical grounds. I'm happy to talk about that more if you like. So about the guiding role of mechanism, there's also a quote. This is from the appendix, first critique, appendix to the dialectic, and there Kant says that chemical explanation is based on the idea of a mechanism. So I think there we have this point that normal scientific investigation, here we try to explain things by means of chemical explanations, they are ultimately based on the idea of a mechanism, so that I think is water on my mills that we are always oriented towards explaining everything mechanically, even though we can never reach that. Further quotes, unity of appearances through matter. This dovetails nicely with what Lorenzo was just saying. Here again, matter is, it can be taken as empirically unconditioned, but then it is merely a regulative principle. Again, matter, mechanism, mechanics tells us what matter does, namely primary determination of matter is motion, matter communicates motion, that's mechanics. And then also, this is from the second critique, so had a hard time finding that quote, but luckily I found it. Even in the second critique, Kant says, the mechanism of nature must always constitute the guiding thread, which is, by the way, the translation obliterates that a bit, but what I amended here is closer to the German original. So also here we have mechanism in this guiding role. So I come to an end. If this is right, then this will provide us with at least the guiding light to a unified concept of mechanism in Kant's critical writings. And the mentioned McLaughlin's dilemma is thereby, I think, also solved, because this shows how mechanism can be necessary while not being constitutive of experience. I'm happy to talk more about the dilemma here at hand. And the upshot for the issue of how can we understand Kant's using mechanism in relation to organisms and human beings, issue of human freedom, is, I think, that he does thereby not mean that these phenomena, are nothing but mechanical phenomena. He only means to say that there's an a priori demand for unifying all appearances by means of mechanical laws. And hence it is the case, if we don't make the distinction between appearances and things in themselves, everything would have to be de facto behind our backs, mechanical, even though we don't know. Okay, yeah, I think this, yeah, I basically said what its perks are of this view, I think, so I'm done. Thank you.
I'm going to take the opportunity, because I didn't see a hand shoot up quickly enough, to ask you a question, if that's okay.
I should say. So, I mean, I was covering a lot of ground. Please ask me about details here. I could not make the case differently than by covering that much ground, but yeah.
So, I have two questions. One is, how do you, this is super interesting. I wasn't aware of, I think it's a great contribution. And it's really interesting that mechanism can have this function of systematicity and unification. How do you deal with the passages where Kant seems to ascribe that systematicity to organic or even teleological unity?
Yeah, great. No, thank you very much. That was a lovely question. No, I think this is exactly at issue in the antinomy about organisms, and I have basically only addressed one part of the antinomy about organisms. The antinomy is a bit complex. At first, in section 70, Kant only formulates it as mechanism or not, but then come these two systems in section 72 and 73, and there we get the idea of a teleological unification of all appearances. And I think this idea of unifying all appearances by means of teleology is sparked by the empirical encounter of organisms. And then we get the second idea. But yeah, there is also the idea of teleological nature, not only of mechanistic nature, I would say.
Because we need the second part. We need to hear your second part. No, my other question was about your distinction between the formal and the material concepts of nature. Coming from Fichte and Schelling, it seems that they're thinking of form, matter will be derived from form, and your material concept seemed to me, in a way, to be providing that sort of direction, right, where matter is going to come from. Versus your formal concept was reminding me of Kant's ideal of pure reason, right, because it's an Inbegriff aller Realität. And Kant specifically says the ideal of pure reason represents the matter, the Stoff of reason. So I was just curious.
Okay, sorry. I had to wrap my mind around what you just said. Can you say the last sentence again?
Kant, the Inbegriff aller Realität, the ideal of pure reason,
yes.
is explicitly for Kant the material, the Stoff. Right?
Yeah.
And so I always associate this Inbegriff with material aspects.
Yeah.
Like content. And versus what you have as a material concept, which is a more interesting
right. Oh, good.
Seems formal in a way, because it's generating, in a way, matter.
Yes. No, okay, thank you. No, that's great. Yeah, no, good. Oh, very nice question. Yeah, no, right. I mean, if I'm right here, then there is the material concept of nature, as I call it, has a material element insofar as it says nature is to be unified, at least by means of these mechanical principles. But the mechanical principles are in some sense, this is very tricky what the status is, not fully a priori, but if it's still a formal investigation, then through the metaphysical foundations we get content. through a merely formal investigation. So in that sense, we get matter out of form. In the transcendental ideal, I think that deals with how we organize the really empirically given matter. And yeah, I should say, I guess I didn't say, the material concept of nature, I should have said it, I wanted to say it, I didn't, is still very general. It still allows for, it's still only guiding us, but there's still, of course, trees and 73 parrots and whatnot, kinds of parrots. I mean, all the wealth of life that there is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I've always had trouble thinking about how the conception of mechanism or mechanics and the metaphysical foundations relates to that in the first critique. You sort of answered part of my question already by when you addressed the antinomy of teleological judgment in that answer, saying that the sort of the regulative mechanism there is based on this mechanistic, the principle of metaphysical foundations. Yeah, not what I might have thought was the cosmological idea as it comes up in the first critique. And so I just want to push a little question, like, would you read this all the way back into the first critique? So the sections in the late antinomies where he says, you know, the conception of world, of mechanism is regulative, and we need that. Were you pushing this all the way back, this metaphysical foundational conception of mechanics, into the uses or of the idea of world in the first critique?
Thank you. I guess the simple answer is yes. I mean, I would say, I mean, the antinomies were not changed in the difference from first to second critique. So I would more say, well, in the metaphysical foundations, Kant clarifies the concept of mechanism that he was using already in the first edition of the critique. I mean, more to be argued for, but that's at least the view I would have sympathies for, what I would want to argue for. But I should say, just to clarify it, the idea of mechanistic nature is the idea we strive for in unifying empirical laws. Whereas in the third antinomy, what is at issue is causes for individual events, events. So there's a difference in what the topic is. I just wanted to flag that.
But late in the sections where he says we need this regulative principle to guide us if we're not going to make a claim about whether nature is finite or infinite, there comes up a regulative principle of nature, of the mechanistic world.
Oh, right.
So that's what that would be this, the fully developed mechanism.
I would think so.
And in the appendix to the dialectic as well, that would also didn't change much in the second edition, so that too would be the full-blown version.
I am committed to that, but I mean, please let me
know.
No,
I'll go back and reread those. We'll read those sections with that in mind.
Okay, good. No, I would hope this works, but please let me know if you see problems.
Thank you. I'll ask more.
Thank you. Super interesting. I only have a very, very small nitpicky comment on page 1. Point number 2, the sentence is, if anything is given to us through the senses, then the metaphysical foundations follow. Shouldn't that be through the outer senses? Like, if we just had inner senses, then wouldn't have matter as a concept, and they wouldn't follow, right? Or,
right.
I don't think it matters.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
nitpicking.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately I would be committed that inner sense is anyway an abstraction from what there is. So that's why it's probably formulated in that way. No, I mean, I think there is, what I mean to say is just there's sensibility, and now there's an aspect of inner and outer sense to it. But anyway, yeah, I'm happy to say more. Okay, good.
Question, if you can say a bit more about the difference between empirical laws and mechanical laws. So how exactly they do relate, and especially from reading the passage from the general remark to dynamics and contrasting it with the passage from Friedman, I'm not sure what's so what the regulative ideal is ultimately about? Is it about the reduction to, let's say, attraction and repulsion? So you need the full story of how you can reduce an empirical law to the material, say, forces, or rather is like the exploration of all the possible empirical, maybe it's the same thing, but so the other, like one is sort of more like a regressive kind of thing, and the other is like towards all possible infinite empirical laws. So what's
Oh, I see. Now, so I would think what is at issue is, so I mean, a more substantive claim that I make is that in reducing given empirical laws, we are guided ultimately. There's this, I should say, there are of course these ideas like the idea of pure earth, pure water, and so on. So there are these ideas, they guide us in that case, chemistry. And I just want to say there's ultimately this idea of mechanistic nature by means of which we try to unify all appearances and more concretely now empirical laws. That holds just for whatever given empirical laws we want to unify. And now you mentioned this like going outwards. I think that would just be more a matter of, well, okay, let's collect all the empirical laws there are. There would not be, the idea of mechanistic nature would not be directly involved, just once we try to unify the empirical laws we found out.
Okay, thank you so much.